All right, in Proverbs chapter 20 in our study this evening. Proverbs chapter 20. Yet in chapter 20 we'll see a few of the principles that we have already discussed in other of the chapters, but we'll look at them briefly anyway as we move on to some other points within the chapter. Chapter 20 and verse 1 is a passage that we often use with regard to those who do not understand God's thinking concerning the consumption of alcoholic beverages. And the passage simply says, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. This verse stating truth would also suggest to us that there are a lot of unwise people in the world. Whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. We have to understand in that connection that, and we usually spend a little bit of time on that word wine, and as it is used in the Bible, it is not always used in the same connotation or context in which we use it today. It's used in the Bible, everything from the grape juice still in the grape, still on the vine, all the way to that which would be considered alcoholic in nature. And so just to say wine and talk in biblical terms really doesn't define anything. But looking at the context itself will certainly help us define what it is that is under consideration. In this regard, the word wine is used with regard to that which is displeasing to God, that which is a mocker. And when you look at the word mocker in the Old Testament and in the original, it would suggest the end result of those who would be deceived by wine, that is, that which would alter one's thinking. How do people who have their thinking altered by alcoholic beverage usually act? How do they respond, for example, to holy things? They have no regard for holy things. They have no use for them. How do they usually respond to reproof? They don't want to hear any kind of reproof. How do they deal with things that are of a serious nature? They laugh at it, laugh at it, ridicule it. And so that's the concept that is presented in the first part of this verse. That is, those who are so deceived by wine, so affected by wine, that is, wine that will affect one's thinking, are the kind of people who will mock at things that are holy, things that are sacred, things that are serious. And there are a lot of other passages that could be used in that regard. One that I like to use, especially with regard to some of our brethren even who like to suggest that drunkenness is the thing under consideration, not what they would classify as social drinking. And I think Galatians chapter 5 is a passage that certainly must be considered in that regard. Within the list of those works of the flesh, fornication, adultery, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresy, envies, drunkenness, revelings, and such like. If I understand the Greek correctly, for the word that is translated drunkenness, it suggests the process of becoming that. Not drunkenness itself, but the process of becoming drunk. What is the process of becoming drunk? Drinking. And so what that passage, number one, within that word itself, would condemn is the process that leads to drunkenness, which is drinking. Now, in addition to that, in that section of Scripture, you have another phrase, and such like. Well, what is such like in connection with drunkenness or the process of becoming drunk? Anything in connection with that process. So there's no way that one can take the Bible as it is and justify the concept of social drinking. Now, there have been a lot of efforts to do so, but it has to ignore certain principles that are taught within the Scriptures. And so the proverb writer here begins with that idea, wine and the effect that it has on one who is deceived by it. He also says strong drink is raging. Now, the word raging here is the idea of being noisy and boisterous. Does that seemingly fit the description of those that you might know who would participate in strong drink? In most cases, that is, in fact, the case. They're noisy, they're boisterous, they're out of control, saying things, doing things, acting in ways that are certainly unbecoming to the child of God. And so there's absolutely nothing in this verse that would give any encouragement to the participation in the drinking of drinks that will alter one's thinking in that regard. And I know I've heard people make the argument of, just one beer or two beers or whatever really doesn't have an effect. Those people simply do not know what they're talking about. I recall years ago when we were in a community where we were fighting against, quote, liquor by the drink referendum. And in the research that I did in that regard, one of the things I remember very clearly is a deal that those who wanted to prove their point set up on a driving course and would have a person drive through that course with certain aspects of it without any consumption of alcoholic beverage at all. And then after one beer, and see some differences. After two, after three, after four, and eventually got to where they couldn't even go through the course. But the point is that just one will affect one's reaction to certain things. And so to say that you can drink a beer and have no effect on you, my suggestion is you need to do a little research. You really don't know what you're talking about. You may think that it doesn't. It may appear to you that it doesn't. But it has been proven that it does. Why would a child of God want to participate in that kind of thing? You know, one of the things, another verse that might be considered in that regard is Paul's statement in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Abstain from every appearance of evil. How is the child of God going to respond to that which appears to be evil? You're going to stay away from it. Whether it is speech, whether it is the consumption of drink, whether it is dress. I mean, you can just list any category you want to list. And the child of God is going to do the best of his ability or her ability to steer clear of that kind of thing. Even if it does not have any effect on you, as you might believe. Wrongly so. But even if you believe that it doesn't have any effect on you, what effect does it have on your influence relative to others if you participate? That's another aspect of it that must be considered as a child of God. And so this verse is not going to give any encouragement or support to that kind of thing at all. And so his concluding statement is, whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. In verse 3, he said, it is an honor for a man to cease from strife, but every fool will be meddling. What about the reverse of that first statement? It is an honor for a man to cease from strife. What about the opposite of that? Would that not be the obvious conclusion? it is a dishonor for a man to be involved in strife. If it's an honor to cease from it, it would be a dishonor to engage in it, wouldn't it? The child of God, again, is not going to be involved in that kind of thing. We just don't need to be dabbling in other people's business. You might recall, it's always been an interesting point, 1 Peter chapter 4. Whenever Peter said, "Let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed." Where is the comfort and consolation if one suffers from meddling in somebody else's business? The Bible provides no comfort for that kind of person. Now, there are areas that would not be classified as meddling where we are to express interest in one another as children of God. For example, Hebrews chapter 10, consider one another to provoke unto love and good works. Or Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, man be overtaken in a fault. You which are spiritual, restore such a one. And so there are certain verses that give us responsibility toward one another as brothers and sisters in Christ in our spiritual welfare. But beyond that, we need to stay out of each other's business. If somebody asks of us our opinion or counsel or whatever, then that's one thing. But for us to stick our nose in, if we get it punched, there's no comfort in the Scriptures in that regard. But those who will meddle in other people's business are classified by God here as what? As a fool. As a fool. What does he say? Every fool will be meddling. Now, that's what God thinks about meddling in other people's business. Now, you make it think it's all right for you to do it. But God says if you do, you're a fool. How's that going to fare in judgment when we stand before the judge of all the earth if we have been guilty of that which God classifies as foolish? Certainly, we need not be involved in that. You know, from a preaching standpoint, and I've talked to police officers, law enforcement officers, I've talked to counselors about this very thing. One of the most dreaded areas of trying to help people with their business is in marriage counseling. What happens? You talk to one, what are you convinced after you talk to that one? It's all the other one's fault. Well, then when you talk to that one, what do you find? It's all the first one's fault. And then what happens in the end? They both turn against you. They both turn against you. And so that's one of the most dreaded areas of counsel for and squabbles and that kind of thing. Usually it doesn't turn out so well for the one who's trying to help. But again, we need to stay in our own business and stay out of other people's business. Verse 4 is an area that we've seen, at least in principle, we've seen mentioned several times with regard to the sluggard. The sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold. Therefore shall he beg in harvest and have nothing. Is it not true that sometimes we have to work at an inconvenient time to be sure that we are prepared for every day? But it would seem to me in the first part of this verse, the sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold. Do you sense any other explanation of that? I mean, what do you think of when you see that statement? The sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold. Well, laziness, yes, that's obviously involved. But what will a lazy person do to get out of work? Think of every excuse under the sun. Think of every excuse. And that's what I thought about when I read this. Well, here's his excuse. It's a little too cold today. What's going to be his excuse when it warms up? It'll be something else. Yeah, too hot. So that's kind of the principle involved. The sluggard, the lazy person, is not going to work. And when he has need, what's he going to have? He's going to have nothing. We've already seen in previous Proverbs where it's going to lead to poverty. And here whenever he thinks it's time for the harvest and he hasn't gone out to plow, how can he expect a harvest? He's going to have nothing. So again, we see that concept involved. In verse 5, counsel in the heart of man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. This sounds to me a lot like what little bit I know about counseling. John, maybe you can help us out here. What is the very basis upon which a counselor works when he's trying to help somebody who's got problems? What's one of his basic methods of help? Asking questions, leading questions, trying to draw out of that individual that which is deep within, those deep waters. On the surface, you don't figure it out. And that's why I often tell people very quickly, I am not a counselor. I'm not educated in that. I don't have that ability. But there are those who have that ability. They're educated in that way to try to help you figure out what your problem is and to draw out whatever is deep in the heart. Whatever it is that on the inside that needs to be brought out to help a person better deal with their problems. And you think about that with regard to Jesus' ministry. How many times, and I'm not expecting a number here, but how many times did Jesus deal with issues in people's lives by asking questions? That was one of his primary ways of dealing with circumstances. Pose a question. Ask a question. Get them to respond to a question. And so that is at least involved here to when we can get the revelation of the heart, then you're in a position to help someone solve those deep areas of the heart. In verse 6, most men will proclaim every one his own goodness, but a faithful man who can find. A couple of different thoughts that seem to be pretty prominent among commentators on this particular verse especially. One is, as you just read it and just a basic reading of it, it just simply says that you can find a lot of people who will tell you how good they are. Many men will proclaim everyone his own goodness, but a faithful man who can find. A faithful man is not going to be found boasting about his goodness. And that's one principle that was brought out from this proverb. And that's pretty much true, isn't it? You can find a lot of people who will tell you how good they are. But you find a faithful man, and you will not find an individual boasting about his goodness at all. Because he has a spirit of humility. He's not going to go that route. Another area of thought with regard to this particular proverb is that there are a lot of people who have a lot of goodness about them. And that's true, isn't it? I mean, you can think of many people that you know with whom you're associated who are basically good people. And I'm not using the word good here in the biblical sense. I'm talking about just in a general sense. They're just good people. They're good neighbors. They'll do anything for you. They'll help you. As we say, they'll give you the shirt off their back. But who can find a faithful man? That turns the attention to Abraham. When God was going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, what was Abraham's plea to God? If I can find 50 righteous people, will you save the city? Yeah. 40? Yeah. 30? Yeah. But then you think about that same phrase, but a faithful man who can find. Are they available? Are there faithful men? Sure they are. How does Proverbs 31:10 begin, ladies? Who can find a virtuous woman? Does that mean there are not any out there? Absolutely not, because the rest of the chapter is devoted to a description of that woman. And so the idea here is not so much that there are no faithful men, but the idea is that there are not nearly as many faithful men as there are men who would like to declare that they're faithful. And I see, within this proverb, I see the attitude of humility that is a part of the life of a faithful child of God. Not going to go around boasting about. You think about, you remember the Pharisee and the publican that went into the temple to pray? How did the Pharisee, first of all, with whom did the Pharisee pray? Himself. He wasn't praying with God, praying with himself. What did he do? How did he go about this prayer life? I mean, after all, this is one of the most, quote, righteous men available because he's a Pharisee. Boasting about all of the things that he had done. I'm so thankful I'm not like everybody else. I mean, look at all the good I do compared to everybody else. The publican wouldn't lift up so much his eyes into heaven, smote upon his breast and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. There's the difference in the proud, boastful heart and the heart of humility. Which one characterizes the faithful child of God? Obviously, the heart of humility. The just man, verse 7, walketh in his integrity. His children are blessed after him. What does that proverb say to you? The way we walk as fathers can definitely have an effect on our children. If we've lived a just and upright life, that should be a blessing to our children. Of course, the opposite of that is just as true. But here within this verse, again, is the influence of good parents. How much easier it should be for the life of their children. What about the children of an individual who is known as a drunkard, as a crook? I mean, just the worst things in life. How difficult is it for the children of that person? Well, what's the major thing they have to do? Live down the reputation of their parent. I mean, how often do we hear like father, like son? Well, is this son going to be like that crooked, drunk, whatever kind of father? He has to prove himself. But the same is true with a godly parent. Their children don't have to live down any reputation. They have to live up to a reputation, don't they? But it's much easier for them in that regard. Encouragement to parents to be the kind of parents we ought to be. And in so doing, we can make it a little bit easier in life on our children. Who can say, verse 9, who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from my sin? Someone answer that. Who can say, I have made my heart clean? Who makes our heart clean? God does. You remember in Psalm 51, what was David's plea to God? Create in me, O God, a clean heart. We can't do that ourselves. God has to do that. The latter part of it, I am pure from my sin. How do we become pure from sin? Through the blood of Christ. not through our own doing, seeing ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth. Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 1. And so it's through the blood of Christ that we are clean and pure relative to sin. In 1 John 1, verses 8 and 10, what did John say about that? If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, we are a liar, we make God a liar. His word, the truth's not in us. Now, those are pretty serious accusations out of those two verses. Now, we can be clean, we can be pure, but it's not because what we've done. It's through the blood of Christ and our obedience to His will that we're made clean. So, again, the idea of a recognition of who we are before God, what God should mean to us in our lives because of what He provides in that regard. Verse 10, divers weights and divers measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. What is the word divers? We don't use that in our everyday language much today. Different, various. So what's the idea of this proverb, divers weights and divers measures? And the result being an abomination of the Lord. Different standards. That's the idea. You use one standard to sell and use another standard to buy. Weights. Somebody, if you're selling something by the pound and you go to somebody who's buying things, whatever you're selling by the pound, and they use one set of weights to basically say you don't have as much here as you thought you did. But then when they get ready to sell it to somebody else, they pull out another set of weights and it weighs more than it did when it was bought. Dishonest. That's what's involved here, is dishonesty. Dishonesty is an abomination to God. What did Paul say in Romans chapter 12? Provide things honest in the sight of all men. That again is the characteristic of the child of God. And I hope as we're going through these, maybe some way you can remember some of these things, how many different areas of one's personal life do the Proverbs reach? I mean, I don't believe you could think of one area of your personal life concerning which there is not a proverb that gives some control to it. I mean, just so many. A lot of times what we think of is just the little things in life. But they're big things in the eyes of God for His children to respect those little things. So he's just simply talking about dishonesty in that regard. Verse 12 is an interesting verse. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord hath made even both of them. What do you get out of that proverb? I don't have any statistics or information of that kind of sort, but you can find it in different places. The power, the magnitude of the eye. I know sometimes that begins to fail on us, and we have to come up with these to see a little better. But the ability to see the things that we see in life, who gave us that ability? God gave us that ability. Here, I've heard Ann talk about a number of times. Her mother had a hearing problem, and she'd had some surgery or whatever, and then she could hear the noise of her heels walking down the hallway. I think this is what you said before. And her question was, what is that hammering? She had never heard her own heels hitting the floor. But now she can hear that. I heard just recently of someone who had, I don't remember now if they'd had surgery or hearing aid or whatever, but because of whatever had happened, walked outside and began to hear the birds sing. And they'd never heard those birds before. What an instrument God has provided for us to be able to see and hear things that go on in our lives around us. This simply reminds us of, number one, what was it? The psalmist said how wonderfully made man really is. And when you begin to study about the makeup of man from a medical, scientific, physical point of view, I mean, what keeps you going? What keeps that blood flowing? Jimmy, how often do you have to repair water pumps? Pretty regular. Pretty regular, because they wear out, don't they? But some of us have pumps inside us that mine's been pumping for almost 66 years. Hadn't had to have a valve replaced. Hadn't had to have anything done to it at all yet. Pretty amazing, isn't it, that old pump can just keep on pumping. Day in and day out, year in and year out. How fearfully and wonderfully made we are. And so this proverb just, I think, reiterates the wonder of man that God has created. That's what we really are. It is, verse 14, it is not, saith the buyer. But when he is gone his way, then he boasteth. What do you get out of that one? What is the word not? Nothing. Nothing. You want to sell something. And somebody comes to look at your merchandise you have for sale, and they say, why are you asking such a price for that? That's not worth anything. What are they trying to do? Trying to get you down on your price. Trying to get a steal, as we call it sometimes. And then when they turn and leave you, and they go to their friend, man, look what a bargain I got. You wouldn't believe how little I paid for this marvelous item here. What have you done? You have cheated somebody out of the real value of what they have. Pretty much the same as we looked back up there a moment ago in verse 10 with the divers weights and divers measures. You used one language when you were trying to buy the product. You used another language after you bought that product. Different set of measures. Dishonesty. That's not characteristic of the child of God. And I'm not suggesting that you can't try to Jew somebody down a little bit. That's not what this is all about. This is the intent to be dishonest and deceitful here. And that principle, of course, is held up throughout the Scriptures. Verse 15 helps us to see again how God looks at things compared to how men look at things. What was it Isaiah said? Quoting from God, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways, saith the Lord. There is gold and a multitude of rubies, but the lips of knowledge are a precious jewel. What's precious to man? The gold and the silver. What's precious to God? Lips of knowledge. Someone who has, and how much we have looked throughout the course of our study of the Proverbs thus far, how much emphasis is placed on our securing all of the knowledge that we can, and the wisdom to use it, and the understanding of it. I mean, we've seen that over and over and over again from the very first. The importance of wisdom and understanding and knowledge. And we've also seen a number of verses within these Proverbs that describe the lips of the fool. But here he helps us to see what is of value to God. And that is those lips of knowledge. Not the lips of the fool, but the lips of knowledge. Verse 16, take his garment that is surety for a stranger, and take a pledge of him for a strange woman. First of all, in the Hebrew, the phrase strange woman there is more literally just translated foreigners. Not dealing with the strange woman as that phrase is used in a lot of other places in the Bible itself. But what is the idea of surety here? Take his garment that is surety for a stranger. What's the principle? How would we word that today? Like a down payment. Basically, maybe the idea of co-signing with someone. And really what he's saying here is, be careful about promising to be responsible for a stranger's debt. I know when I first started out, my dad signed a few notes for me, but he intended to back it up if I failed. But he didn't intend for me to fail, I can assure you. But the idea here is that if you make a promise that you're going to be responsible for somebody's debt, you better be sure that you have the means to cover it if they fail. Because it's going to come back on you. Now look at the latter part of it. Or the idea of take his garment. What's going to happen if you say you'll stand good for somebody's debt and they fail on it and it comes back on you and you don't have the means to cover it? What's going to happen? Well, somebody's going to take everything you got. They may even take your clothes. One of the things, and it'll be noted later on in this very chapter if time permits us to get to it. But, you know, one of the things that is so often impressive to me is the degree of punishment for certain things under the Old Testament system. The degree of punishment under the New Testament system. And the degree of punishment in our society today. There is no comparison. And I think this verse implies that. If you stand good for somebody and you don't have the means to cover it and it comes back on you, somebody is going to have the right to take every shirt off of your back. So be careful. Be careful when you promise to cover somebody else's debt if they fail in that regard. Just be careful. Verse 17, bread of deceit is sweet to a man, but afterwards his mouth shall be filled with gravel. Boy, that doesn't sound very appetizing, does it? Doesn't sound appetizing. I mean, you know, you start out with deceit, everything may seem to be going pretty good for you. I mean, you've been deceitful, you've gained by that, oh boy, this is great. But here's a warning. It may not always be that way. There's another interesting parallel to that in Lamentation chapter 3. If you remember the background and context of the book of Lamentation, I'm not going to take the time to go over there to it, but you'll find the same concept of having gravel in your mouth. It's not a very tasteful thing at all. So be careful when you're deceitful. And of course the principle involved here would be you're going to reap what you sow. The chickens are going to come home to roost, as we used to say. Verse 19 gives you a little bit of insight on people you need to avoid. He that goeth about as a talebearer revealeth secrets. Therefore meddle not with him that flattereth with the lips. You know, there's a little principle that I heard many, many years ago, and I really believe it to be the truth. If somebody will talk to you about somebody else, they'll talk to somebody else about you. So be careful about dealing with those people. Just be careful. Just skipping over. Verse 22, say not thou, I will recompense evil, but wait on the Lord, and He shall save thee. What's the principle involved there? Vengeance belongs to whom? Vengeance belongs to God. I will repay, saith the Lord. That's not our place to take vengeance on anyone. Verse 26 is one of those verses I mentioned a moment ago about punishment. A wise king scattereth the wicked and bringeth the wheel over them. What wheel do you think he might be talking about here? Wheel of the threshing floor. The wheel that was used to press out and to separate, in some cases, the grain from the chaff, or the threshing floor. It was like a huge wheel, and under it were boards that had metal sticking up that was designed to separate the grain from the chaff. And can you imagine laying somebody on that board with that metal in it and then pulling that wheel over them? Some commentators will try to suggest that this is figurative language, surely. But when you read some of the things, and I had one passage in mind there, 2 Samuel chapter 12. Just make a note of this. We don't have time to look at it. But 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 31, look at some of the things that David did to punish some people, if you think this is bad. That's why I say punishment in the Old Testament was serious. It wasn't a slap on the back of the hand. Not that we need people have the threshing wheel pulled over them today, but I would suggest that we need punishment to be a lot more severe than what we're seeing in our day and time. Love, verse 29, the glory of young men is their strength, and the beauty of old men is the gray head. If you guys are ashamed of the gray hair in your head, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Because that is the beauty of an old man, is the gray hair. Oh, we know how those young men act, man. They're stout. They can just, they can handle anything. That's really their thing in life. The old man doesn't have any hair, has got problems. But I found it interesting in studying through this, and one of the commentators that I read in this regard said, in his opinion, one of the most foolish things was an old man trying to act like a young man. Usually gets you in trouble. Verse 30, the blueness of a wound cleanseth away evil. So do the stripes, the inward parts of the belly. There again is the need for punishment. The blueness of the wound cleanse away evil. It'll help get away some of the evil. So some good principles here for us if we'll just take note of. Chapter 21, Lord willing, in our study next Wednesday.